Iron Man is directed by Jon Favreau, and it stars Robert Downey Jr., Gwyneth Paltrow, Jeff Bridges, and Terrence Howard.
And Tony Stark, a genius billionaire playboy, is captured by a group of terrorists and is told he must build one of his newest military weapons, but instead he decides to build a weaponized iron suit which he uses to escape, and afterwards he decides to perfect this new invention of his, becoming Iron Man. And this is the first of 18 movies already released in the Marvel Cinematic Universe leading up to Avengers Infinity War Part 1.
Yeah, and with that movie coming out on April 27th, we're going to try to review as many of the MCU movies that we can. And even if we don't get through all of them before Infinity War comes out, we'll at least have Part 2, which comes out next year, to get the rest of them.
Now, this movie had a lot of pressure to succeed. As Jon Favreau stated that Marvel had used a lot of their characters as collateral in order to make a deal to get over $500 million. And Marvel really wanted to make a film library, and if this movie didn't succeed, they would have lost those characters, and they also would have lost their rights to a film library.
And it was a really big gamble to use the character of Iron Man, especially when you consider going back in time about like 10 years before this movie came out. Iron Man wasn't that big of a character for Marvel like he is today. He is almost pretty much like a B-rate character. He wasn't like Spider-Man or Hulk or Captain America. He was very obscure.
Now, I hadn't seen this movie in a long time, so I didn't remember a whole bunch from it. I remember the storyline and stuff, but I don't remember the feeling of it. You know, after all these MCU movies that we've been seeing here lately, I thought I was going to have a similar feeling, but it doesn't. Iron Man really, you know, it's the beginning of all of it, and they've really kind of just totally changed their style, especially Disney taking over. You have a lot of jokes in their movies nowadays. Especially in Thor Ragnarok, which a lot of people like, but we did it. There's jokes all throughout. But this movie, there is jokes in it, but the jokes don't feel written. And in fact, I believe there's a lot of this movie that's actually ad-libbed from Robert Downey Jr. himself. And so a lot of the jokes don't feel forced. A lot of the jokes don't feel written, especially since most of the movie is not purely funny. All the comedy, mainly most of the comedy, does come from Tony Stark himself, and not so much that he's saying jokes, but just him being this jerk, this douchebag of a guy. It just kind of becomes funny what he says.
A lot of this movie is ad-libbed. I didn't know this whenever I first saw it. I didn't know about it until pretty recently, that most of the script to this movie wasn't finished when they started filming, so a lot of this movie was ad-libbed, not just Robert Downey Jr.'s lines. So just like whenever you hear that movie is ad-libbed, it's sort of a scary feeling, especially like Thor Ragnarok. I know a lot of people liked it, but it came out that a lot of that movie was ad-libbed, and it was sort of, you can tell a lot of it was ad-libbed, and it wasn't a good thing, at least for me. But Iron Man felt just so much more natural. It just felt like actual conversation. It didn't feel just like thrown in forced jokes that just had to be there just because it was a Marvel movie.
And putting all that together, after seeing all these MCU movies, Iron Man is really a breath of fresh air. Even though it's the first one, it really is a breath of fresh air to watch again. Because, like we said, it doesn't really even feel like a superhero movie in terms of today. You know, it really is very grounded. And I really love comic book movies, but if I'm being completely honest, I understand that they are kind of dumbing down audiences to actual depth in movies and actual seriousness and slowness. They're dumbing down audiences a lot to where audiences will watch a movie and don't really like slowness anymore. They don't understand slowness needs to be part of movies sometimes. And Iron Man does have not really slow moments, but it has its moments that not a whole bunch is happening, but it's all very intriguing.
Especially considering going back and rewatching this Iron Man movie, I honestly think that Disney sort of ruined Marvel in a way. I'm not talking about financially, because obviously they made billions and billions of dollars, but just quality-wise to their movies, there's so much more just comedies and just more lighthearted, and it's not like there's not seriousness and deep meaning to a lot of their movies nowadays.
The best thing about this movie is probably the character of Tony Stark. This character is actually extremely well written. This movie actually really respects its audience, you know, to really be able to dig deep into this character, because this character actually goes through a few different arcs in this movie, and does go through arcs later on. But what's really interesting about this movie is that one of his bigger arcs does happen before maybe like 30-40 minutes into the movie, after he escapes the cave. You know, because before that he's this big military guy, really caring about money, and after, what's his name? Jensen, the guy who is helping him in the cave, dies, which actually, whenever Jensen dies is probably one of my favorite scenes ever in the MCU.
Mine too.
Yeah. And so his character decides that he no longer wants to sell weapons. He doesn't want to sell weapons with his company anymore, which is insane because that is their biggest source of profit. But he just doesn't want to do it anymore after what he's experienced in the cave. He hasn't even become Iron Man here yet. I mean, he's been in the Iron Suit, but he hasn't become Iron Man yet. And even before all that, he changes as a person. And you see some kind of little speck of light in him at this point throughout the movie, not even halfway through.
And considering the arc that Tony Stark has, it's sort of hard to believe that this movie is only 2 hours and 6 minutes. It honestly feels like it's a movie that needed to be 2.5 hours, but not like really in a bad way. It's just incredible to think about how much they were able to manage to fit into this movie and still only be about 2 hours long.
This whole movie is just jam-packed with tons of stuff happening all throughout it, but nothing ever feels rushed. Everything feels very, very intelligently placed.
And it's funny because this is one of Marvel's first times in their movies turning pretty much a big-headed a-hole into a good man and a superhero, because then you have like Doctor Strange and Thor and Peter Quill.
And this movie casts some of the most perfect people for their characters. You have Robert Downey Jr., who was kind of a risk, you know. A lot of people kind of didn't like him that much. In fact, I know one of my aunts saw that Robert Downey Jr. was going to play Iron Man and didn't like it because she was saying that this guy used to be a druggie, you know, and it had been a few years since he'd come clean, but this movie was his comeback. You know, he's now one of the most famous movie stars right now. You know, he comes back with this movie. It's so great, and his performance is fantastic in all the scenes. His wit in this movie, which he's a genius, so his wit comes out, but Robert Downey Jr. displays it so well, like it's nothing. Like it's just his talking because he's just so smart. You have Jeff Bridges. Jeff Bridges did phenomenal in this movie as Obadiah Stane. Obadiah Stane is one of my favorite villains in the MCU that I haven't seen this movie in a while, so I just realized how great of a villain Obadiah Stane actually is.
And Jeff Bridges probably had one of the best line deliveries I've ever heard.
Honestly, it's impossible.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
And the character of Obadiah Stane was handled so well, especially with revealing that he was the actual villain in this movie. They don't really make any big deal about it. It's nothing. Someone closes the door and you see Obadiah Stane standing right there. You know, if you compare that, not even just compare it, just looking at it, and you know, looking at how Iron Man 3 pretty much did kind of the same thing, except they did it terribly with the Mandarin.
Now, this movie had Terrence Howard playing Rhodey, Tony Stark's best friend, which we all know that in the future Marvel movies he was replaced by Don Cheadle. But honestly, I liked Terrence Howard as a character more than Don Cheadle, and it's because that Terrence Howard and Robert Downey Jr. just felt more like best friends who've known each other for a long time, where Don Cheadle and Robert Downey Jr. just feel like pretty much just acquaintances. And honestly, don't really like Don Cheadle's acting that much. I haven't seen him on any other movies, so I'm not saying anything about his other movies. I just don't like his acting in the Marvel movies. But Terrence Howard, just their banter between Tony Stark and Rhodey just feels a lot more natural.
Yeah, and that's another thing this movie does very well at, is establishing relationships. And you have the relationship between Tony Stark and Pepper Potts, which at the very beginning of this movie, they show you that there is something between the two. I mean, it's nothing outright, it's nothing big. Is you just see something, you can tell there is something there. And you begin to see this slightly, very, very slowly growing relationship. It's nothing, by the end of the movie, it's almost exactly the same by the very beginning, just a tiny bit over. So they don't really try to do much with it, because I understand that Tony Stark isn't the kind of guy that if you've known for a while, you can easily just start dating, because you understand that Tony Stark needs to go through a lot of changes. Even by the end of this movie, Tony Stark needs to go through a lot more changes. And really, that whole relationship was really just brought together so well into the second movie even. But the first movie just did all these relationships so well, and they actually feel real. There's a lot of things in this movie that are actually some of my favorite parts in the MCU overall, and that does have to do with the cinematography in different scenes, like the scene whenever Obadiah Stane is taking the arc reactor out of Tony's chest was just so beautiful, especially the lighting. I mean, the lighting was they kind of showed the lighting from his chest, but it was a lot more accented to show something more. And then the cinematography in that scene, the camera started turning to where you actually had Obadiah Stane right over Tony Stark, showing this shift in power that Obadiah Stane retrieved from that scene. And then the beautiful scene whenever Tony Stark is crawling over to his desk trying to reach his original arc reactor in order to save himself. And this movie does one thing that a lot of MCU movies nowadays fail to do, which is, it has this outlandish idea Iron Man does. Just this idea of this guy who's so rich that he's able to do all this stuff like nothing, just not even worry about it. That's how rich he actually is. And it's kind of an outlandish idea, but the execution of this movie, the writing, just makes it feel so grounded. It makes it feel so realistic as best as it can with this idea given.
And another great thing about Iron Man is it's a movie that's not really trying to build a universe like a lot of the MCU movies nowadays. It's just a great standalone movie that you can watch without having to watch any of the future movies. Except for, of course there's the after credit scene, but everything before that just stands on its own. If I had to nitpick for any negatives about this movie, I would probably say that at the end, like the last 10 minutes of the movie, Obadiah Stane goes a little too insane. Like, he goes a little too crazy to where, like, I don't really understand what his plan was. Throughout most of the movie, it's understandable what he's trying to do. He's trying to gain money, gain power, gain Tony Stark's role in the industry. And he sort of feels jealous towards Tony Stark, but towards the end, he just completely turns completely evil and starts destroying the city and everything. I don't really know what his plan was from there on.
So guys, most of y'all have already seen this movie, so y'all already know how amazing this movie actually is. This movie has fantastic writing, fantastic acting, beautiful cinematography that really accents the scenes. If you haven't seen this movie, and maybe you haven't seen this movie because you don't like superhero movies, I actually recommend seeing this movie because this movie really it's really different than most superhero movies are written.
Yeah, and it's honestly up there for my favorite superhero movies of all time. And not only that, it's pretty much up there with my favorite movies in general of all time.
We are going to say that Iron Man is 95% awesome. So guys, like Zach said earlier, we are going to try to watch as many of the MCU movies as possible before Avengers Infinity War Part 1 comes out. We are going to be watching them out of order though, because we want to make sure to put the main ones out before this movie comes out. So our next one should be Captain America, the First Avenger. So anyways guys, if you like this video, go make sure to like and subscribe. Also comment below and tell us how you like this movie. How would you rank this movie amongst all the other MCU movies so far?
And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all at 2 Awesome Men.
And as always, thank you so much for watching, and you will see us later.